Welcome everyone. Welcome to this side panel to this year's edition of the Vienna Energy Forum. I'm really pleased to welcome everybody who will participate today. My name is Magdalena Kuneva. I'm the Director General of REAP, the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Partnership, which is a 20-year-old multilateral, multi-stakeholder partnership organization which is dedicated to clean energy and energy access in developing and emerging markets. It is my great pleasure to introduce the participants in today's panel discussion on the role of green banks in developing countries. We have with us several distinguished participants. Let me introduce them quickly. Starting with Samuel Bwalya, who is the Managing Director of the Development Bank of Zambia. On the call today, on the webinar, we also have Olympus Mandala, who is the head for climate and environment for the Development Bank of South Africa. And we also have Franny Luthier, who is the CEO of Southbridge Investments. We also have Andrea Collins, who is the Director for Global Green Bank Development with the Coalition for Green Capital. This is the panel that will talk to us today on two questions. Number one, we will be discussing the role of the Green Bank model in developing countries with a focus on Africa. Number two, we will be looking at the requirements so that the model is fit for purpose for the specific local markets and conditions in these countries in particular. Let me just add that there are significant gaps across all climate sectors in developing countries, and these gaps are estimated to be especially significant and in the least developed countries. So the growth that we've seen in some countries is not distributed equally across the countries. Also, according to latest estimates, almost 600 million people in Africa are without access to electricity. In addition to that, we have significant adaptation needs. And as you're aware, it's not just challenges, it's also opportunities. According to some estimates, only the mini-grid development presents 90 billion investment opportunity before 2030. However, the local financial institutions rarely participate in financing the clean energy assets, specifically off-grid solar, even though new business models and falling technology prices have led to significant growth of the sector. Today, we will be discussing the role of green banks as specialized financial facilities that are specifically designed to grow investments into climate sectors and the application of this model to developing countries. Let me first ask Andrea from the Coalition for Green Capital to tell us a bit more about her experiences with the Green Bank model. What is a Green Bank, and why is this model applicable to developing countries? What are some of the factors that make it relevant for developing countries?
Thank you, Magdalena. And I'm going to now share the screen and look at a few slides as I respond to Magdalena's questions. There.
We don't see the slides yet. Would you like to share them?
They are being shared now. Is that not the case? Magdalena?
We don't see them yet. We don't see the slides yet.
Okay.
But others can see them. Thank you very much. So you can proceed.
Others can see them?
Andy, may I recommend that during your presentation, you turn off your video for better connectivity? Now it's fine. I think the slides are seeable.
Okay, so can I continue as they are, or should I go back and cut out a video?
Yes.
Okay.
We see the slides. Thank you so much.
Sure. So as Magdalena invited, I'll provide a grounding to the conversation by sharing a bit of information about what green banks actually are and how they function as an important element of the climate finance ecosystem with an eye to developing countries. So green banks are probably ill-named. They're not really best conceived of as banks. They're better understood as climate finance facilities that are designed specifically to sit within a market and serve to crowd in and mobilize private investment by addressing market barriers and reducing obstacles, reducing constraints to better allow the flow of private investment. They typically are facilities that are formed, especially in developing countries. They are typically formed as part of existing institutions, and we'll hear more about that from Olympus in particular. In that existing institutions that have a consistent mission are well positioned to house a new climate finance facility. In developed countries and in some situations, green banks are also formed as new standalone institutions, but they can in that form be more challenging to stand up, and they can be more challenging to capitalize without a pre-existing balance sheet and track record of investment. So that's one thing to keep in mind. In terms of their nature, they are formed with a dedicated mission to crowd in private investment by addressing market barriers. It's really important to note that they are formed specifically with an eye to not competing with the commercial sector, but working with the commercial sector to enable the flow of investment into sustainable green and climate related projects. They typically have a geographic focus that is national. They can be subnational, and they can also serve a number of countries, which again is an example that we'll hear more about in a bit. The capital base for a green bank comes from a mix of public and private capital. The capital is usually public purpose capital that is used to co-finance at the project level with private capital. So scarce public capital is used to leverage and enable the flow of private investment. And their role in the market is to serve really as an innovator, capital provider. They are often adjacent to project preparation facilities so they can make the pipeline of projects more robust. And they serve a critical role in providing feedback to the policy environment of the nation within which they sit. Green banks are a model that have been on the ground and have been proven largely in OECD countries. And if we had more time, I could give you more detail on that. But at this point, I will just share this high-level view of what green banks have accomplished to date. And these figures are about a year old. They'll be updated shortly. But roughly, existing green banks have used about 70 billion US dollar equivalents to leverage. I mean, they've used about 24 billion US dollars to leverage more than 70 billion in climate-related investment, with resulting reduction in carbon. So there's quite a track record of best practice to pull on as countries begin to explore and form green banks around the world. I'm going to put a bit of a spotlight on the application of this model in Africa, which will underpin a couple of our speakers. And I'm going to reference a study recently done by the Climate Investment Funds and African Development Bank. We looked at the potential for green banks across 6 countries, those listed on the right: Ghana, Tunisia, Zambia, Mozambique, Uganda, and Benin. In addition, we are working very closely with the government of Rwanda to actively create a green bank. There is interest in Kenya and interest from countries that our panelists will represent as well. We found through this study, working with stakeholders across all of the relevant sectors, that there is significant opportunity to bring this catalytic leveraged model to Africa to enable countries to build country-driven and country-owned capacity to scale up climate finance. Critical to forming any green bank is identifying the priority sectors and the potential project pipeline and the nature of the market constraints that a green bank would be designed to fill. In all cases, we found that renewable energy and climate-smart agriculture stood out as key priority sectors with significant potential project pipelines of projects that were commercially viable but not quite bankable due to various market constraints. We also found that green cities and clean transport are close behind as a rising sector. And then the kind of green bank interventions that we found are representative of the market constraints and market opportunities that institutions like these are intended to serve. We found that there was a significant need for capacity building, lending in the green sector with commercial banks, risk reduction through a number of financial products, longer tenor, subordinated debt, guarantees, upfront grant funding to reduce collateral requirements, and quite a few others that if we had more time, we could unpack in more detail. And I'll close with this diagram, trying to illustrate a systemic green bank initiative. And I'll just walk you through this very quickly. In this case, which is quite often the preferred structure, green banks have two components, a credit facility and a grant facility for project preparation and feasibility support. That's what the two large green boxes are in the middle. If you look at the green bank facility, the information across the top speaks to the nature of capital that is recruited to capitalize the green bank. And it's a mix of public capital, often through the Green Climate Fund, which is highly concessional, alongside co-finance from other development finance institutions and development partners to create a blended cost of capital and a blended finance approach to enable the green bank to provide the different kinds of financial interventions that will enable it to free up the market. On the National Climate Change Fund side, the idea is that grants are used in parallel with the credit to enable project support, project development, bringing more projects through the pipeline to bankability, and also to reduce upfront project costs so overall the project can be financeable. These funds flow into eligible green projects, and then private co-investment joins in at that level to create the catalytic effect. So I think I'll end there, Magdalena, and stop my screen share and hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Angie, for giving us this overview of the model. Let me just ask a few questions to the rest of the panel, and then I think we will come back to the applicability of the model in developing countries. So if I could now turn to Olympus. Olympus, you are the head of climate finance, environmental finance for Development Bank of South Africa. And could you just tell us why Development Bank of South Africa decided to establish a new climate finance facility? Is this facility modeled on the Green Bank model? What have been some of your experiences with it?
Thank you very much for that question. I missed the last part of the question, but hopefully I'll get through to that. But I think for us, really, the base was to say, you know, we are quite clear that to address the climate crisis, you require significant amount of resources. And these resources, you cannot be expecting them to only be coming from public resources simply because they are limited. Therefore, what makes sense is to say, how do you come up with innovative ways of crowding in private investments? And I think, you know, the use of a green bank model becomes quite key. So for us at the DBSA side, we worked alongside, very key partners such as the Coalition for Green Capital, who were quite instrumental in advising us with regard to, how we approach this. But our starting point was to say, you need to understand the market that you want to address and the key stakeholders. So the starting point for us was to say, we need to engage with the sources of private capital. And in our case, we concentrated more on commercial banks. And we wanted to understand what are the barriers that would prevent significant flows of finances into both mitigation and adaptation activities. And through that work, we found out that there are two key barriers that needed to be overcome. One was simply the provision of subordinated debt to help with the de-risking of projects. But the other was really, how to assist in overcoming the challenges with, funding projects that require long tenures, especially through regulations such as Basel III that the commercial banks will operate under. And, the facility that we put in place, the climate finance facility, that is pretty much modeled after the Greenberg model, was really to have overcome those two main barriers. So with that, we put together market studies, and as I mentioned, work together with key partners, and we're able to approach, the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, and we then funded the facility on a 50-50 basis with the GCF. So 50% coming from the DBSA and 50% coming from the GCF. And the importance of that was that we were able to access very concessional funds from the GCF, as Andy indicated earlier. And we pass through the full concessionality that we receive from the GCF to the projects, which then means even when we blend those resources with our own resources, the blended rate is still quite competitive and able to unlock projects on the ground. And I'm happy to say that we have had quite a significant take-up from the market, and we are seeing a few projects now coming off the ground. So I think one can confidently say at this point that what we have put in place talks to the needs of the market. And I think Andy also mentioned something quite important with regard to building such facilities, to say it makes a lot more sense to incubate it within an existing institution if you want it to take off quite quickly. Like in our case, we have a dedicated team that manages this facility, but from a back office point of view, we can rely on established processes from within the DBSA, and therefore helping us to hit the ground running and start responding to market needs. While met with some of the challenges that we have, today the experience was more to say, receiving funding in dollars and trying to translate it into doing projects in local currency, can be quite a challenge. But I think that is the beauty of starting an innovative product. You get the opportunity to get to customize your offering to the market and respond to the needs accordingly. So we are quite comfortable where we are. We think this is the correct way to go, and a very useful intervention in mobilizing both mitigation and adaptation resources into the market. Thank you. I hope I was heard, because I can see Magdalena seem to be frozen.
Model clearly it presents a good case study for other countries that are looking into the same model. So I wanted to ask you, if you had to do it again, what are the kind of things that you would do that you didn't do the first time? Or what are some of the lessons that you think would be useful for other countries that are looking into the model?
Thank you very much. I think, in designing this facility, you do your best, especially if it's a new facility, to ensure that you anticipate, responding to the needs in the market. And that's exactly what we tried to do when we were putting this together. But I think clearly when you are working on a new financing model, you always find at implementation that there are some of the things that we could have done slightly differently. In our case, I already mentioned the issue around, dealing with, forex issues. So you can just imagine if you're looking at funding projects for a 15-year tenure, and you are looking at swap costs for dollars over that period. In many cases, we would find that it is easier to be swapping maybe up to your 7 years, but going 15 years could be quite challenging because it's very difficult to be predicting where the currency would go. Much worse in our case in South Africa, where our currency experiences very large swings. It is quite volatile, especially against the US dollar. So what we have found as a challenge was, customers happy with the concessionality that we provide, but the cost around taking care of the forex issues becomes quite a bit of an issue. And so what we would do differently going forward is that, the structure that we put in place in terms of managing the currency risk, we would look at that quite tightly. We are currently in negotiations with the GCF to find solutions around that, and the discussions are quite promising. But I guess the positive side is that we have started the fund at a limited scale. When we replicate or expand the facility, we would have dealt with all these issues that I've mentioned, and therefore able to realize significant scale without any hiccups. So the main issue that I would mention is really around, currency issues, especially where you are implementing projects in local currency. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Olympus. And absolutely also from our experience, from RIP's experience, as we're working with local financial institutions to implement dedicated green finance specifically for green SMEs, I could confirm the currency issue is a significant issue, given a lot of the businesses, their revenues are in local currency. Often their only source of lending is in hard currency. It creates a mismatch. And this match has been severely felt in Zambia. So let me actually turn now to Samuel, who is the Managing Director of Development Bank of Zambia. First of all, Samuel, congratulations for the accreditation of Development Bank of Zambia for GCF, a major milestone. And let me ask you a question, especially now, this creates new opportunities for you. My first question is around the value added of the National Development Bank, the National Development Banks and their intersection with the Green Bank model. So how do you see this value addition into the national climate finance ecosystem?
Thank you very much. And let me just re-echo that we are extremely excited with our accreditation to Green Climate Fund, passed at just ended the board meeting of the GCF. So we are basically looking forward to deepening our engagement in climate finance, at least locally here, but also leveraging the funds, the vertical funds that are out there for us. As you know, development banks, I think across Africa and indeed across the world, were set up initially, to address some of the missing markets in the financial sector. You would recall that traditionally you would have the microfinance institutions, and then you do have at the same time the commercial banks working in the financial sector. But it was realized that these two institutions were incapable or were not responsive enough to finance new startups, and especially the SMEs. Therefore, coining a term called the missing middle, where we didn't have a dedicated institution that basically would look at the developmental impact of SMEs and provide financing to them. It was on that background that most development financial institutions in Africa were then established to address the missing markets in the financial sector. Now, when you do come to issues of energy and access to energy, again, we do have a challenge here where neither the microfinance institutions nor the commercial banks have enough appetite. They don't have enough financial appetite to allocate resources to climate change in general projects, but specifically to renewable energy projects in Africa. Partly because these tend to be too risky, but also the tenor they operate in tends to be short-term, and therefore not suitable for most of the energy projects we are talking about, whether they be off-grid or they be, large hydro power stations that tend to be, quite frankly, long-term projects. So for us as a development bank, then we come in to try to fill that void in the financial sector by, first of all, addressing some of the liquidity constraints which are there that would enable the microfinance institutions as well as the commercial banks to provide the resources needed, dedicated resources for renewable energy projects. So we can then act as an apex lender to basically activate both the microfinance institutions and also the commercial banks, providing them with sufficient incentive to be able then to lend to SME sectors that are working in the climate change space. The second asset we bring in terms of our work and our mandate as a development bank is that we can then act in between the green banks and the microfinance institutions and the commercial banks in leveraging those funds that are there, both grants, but also commercial capital, and bringing it together and packaging that commercial capital in a way that it would be able to be utilized by the microfinance institutions and the commercial banks for on lending to those projects. Now, you will recall that for us, our premium is the highest placed on development impact. So when you fund mitigation projects in energy, for instance, our costing is not going to be a market-based costing for those funds. So if we have a blending of public resources and commercial capital together, then we can pass on these funds at the social interest rates, as it is called, at a lower premium to the commercial banks to be able to on lend for green projects. That way, we'll be able to help the market to internalize, the mitigation impacts that will be generated by those projects, and therefore making it possible for those projects to be funded. The second thing that we often do here is that we do have a mandate to develop capacity building, to capacity build projects, to babysit the projects, help develop these projects to a point where they are commercially viable from a perspective of a financial institution. Now, we as a development bank with that particular mandate, then we can play an interfacing role between the green banks and ourselves and the financial sector in helping develop a pipeline that is bankable from a perspective of the financial sector, microfinance institutions if they are so small, or commercial banks if they're slightly larger. But most importantly, also, we can act in the sector directly. We can leverage both public capital, especially for infrastructure, but we can also leverage commercial capital and grants, green finance from vertical funds, for instance, and package these and extend these financial support to green projects. So we can lend directly from the green banks, direct to the SMEs, or directly but via the commercial banks that we are working with. So we can play that role and ensure that then capital can flow into those designated sectors where they are needed and where they will generate the greatest positive impact, whether it be on the development side for us in Zambia, but also on the climate change globally. So I think that's where our utility would be most felt. Lastly, as I mentioned, in our earlier discussion, we are building up perhaps what I would call a digitized platform for for providing credit guarantees in the energy projects, but also more broadly in the financial sector, because in Zambia currently, we don't have players in that particular sector. Now, most energy projects, as you know them, they are quite risky. And the commercial banks or any financial institution doesn't want to take them up, not because they don't have liquidity, but just because they are very, very risky. So we think that as the National Development Bank in Zambia, we need to move in there and de-risk these energy projects so that they can become commercially viable. Now, that's a role we can play. We are not playing that role for profit. Remember, we are playing that role to stimulate development in our own country as a development institution. So we can actually blend the finances, whether from government, whether from the vertical funds, Green Climate Fund and others, grants. We can blend these for developmental impact, both on the climate change in terms of mitigation, but also supporting some adaptation projects in the sector. So I think that's where we see the role of capacity building the financial institutions to be able to play a role of capacity building SMEs to be able to produce bankable, clean energy projects, but also de-risking them in two fronts. One, of course, through a credit guarantee that I mentioned, but most importantly, also, we have a mandate to place equity. As a development bank, we do have a mandate to place equity in those projects. Now, when you put equity and you put capital together, you basically further de-risk these projects, and you will see a lot more projects actually taking shape than if you only restricted yourselves to providing credit and the de-risking instruments. So the fact that we can use that arm of instrument of say, we are going to go with you as an SME, we will invest directly our own equity resources into the project, that will make the project attractive to other potential partners who would like to come on board.
Thank you very much, Samuel. And actually, from what you're describing and all these various tools that you're already using or you are developing currently, I think it is fair to say that the green banks that exist out there use some of the same tools. And it is in reality, as Olympus was saying, often the case that in countries in which there is already development finance architecture, such as there are already existing functioning national development banks, it makes more sense to build functions, the green banking functions, on the basis of what already exists. And often the case, the green bank models in this case develop as part of existing institutions rather than as a new standalone institution. But regardless of how this evolves, because there is no one size-fits-all approach, and we have seen a lot of variations of the model, it is about using innovative financial instruments to grow climate finance and to mobilize private capital in particular. And then I would like to ask a question. Given all these tools, Olympus spoke about longer tenor, especially in the future, let's say longer debt in local currency. You spoke about equity investments, de-risking, so that local financial institutions can invest in clean energy projects on or off-grid capacity building. Then I just want to ask a question: why don't we then see significant amounts of investment in the green sectors? There is no shortage of good business ideas and no shortage of entrepreneur people, no shortage of available capital that is looking to be invested these days. Instruments exist already to crowd in private capital, but we still don't see a lot of uptake of this capital in actual green pipeline in the countries. And there is significant gap between the capital that's available, the instruments that are available, and the actual projects that get financed. So maybe a question, and I'll ask this question to each of you, but maybe starting from Andy. What do you think is on the way of accelerating green project pipelines?
Yeah, so I'll try and address your question, Magdalena, in both the negative and the positive, because they're related. So why, if there is significant potential pipeline, why is it not coming to scale? Generally, the reasons are, of course, market specific, but it relates to a couple of different factors. And again, they're market specific, it varies by country. In quite a few countries, we have found that there is a significant capacity gap at commercial banks, that lending in the green sector has not to date been a priority, and consequently experience and staffing and capacity is often not there on the commercial banking side. And in part that's due to perceptions of and or real risk that have led the banks to be investing in other sectors. So there's a capacity building piece at commercial banks. There is the need for specialized financial products to address particular market gaps. In South Africa, longer tenor was such an issue, and we have found that in other places as well. The need to reduce the need for exorbitant collateral is also a significant issue. So different kinds of products that could either provide guarantees or upfront grants to help reduce the need for collateral has been a critical barrier. The need to bring projects forward from the pipeline so they are truly bankable is another sort of cross-cutting issue. And I know that at the DBSA, the climate finance facility is placed adjacent to their project preparation unit. And something along those lines seems to be necessary across the board to more effectively work with developers to support bankability. So really there isn't a simple magic bullet answer, but it is that array of market barriers, be it tenor, risk, and the need for subordinated capital, the need for guarantees, loan loss reserves. Aggregation is a big issue where you're looking at microgrid, mini-grid, off-grid kinds of solutions. The need to be able to bundle smaller projects and aggregate them so they are more affordably capitalized is another key intervention that we have found across the board. So those are some of the components that would provide a bit of a window into the question that you're asking. And maybe I'll stop there for a moment and pass it on to Olympus and Samuel.
Yes, thank you, Andy. Yes, Olympus, if you could elaborate further, what are your experiences with building the demand side, not so much the supply side, but the demand side, and accelerating some of these projects and project pipelines so they're ready for investment?
Thank you very much for the question. I think Andy has to a great extent touched on this. I think for me, I see a great barrier more around project preparation, as Andy mentioned. And there are various interventions in the market to address project preparation. But if you look at what is out there, the entry point for these various projects preparation facilities are not the same. So for example, for us at the DBSA, we would typically entertain supporting a project from a preparation point of view if it's already at feasibility stage. So if you were to get anything, pre that stage, you would not be able to support it through our project, preparation facility. I'll give you an example of a facility that we have put in place recently at the DBSA to support embedded generation projects. So the facility is in place and ready to support projects. But when we started to look at what is there in the market, especially in the municipal space, we found that there's a lot of interest, but projects are sitting even way before our project preparation entry phase. Fortunately, we had an application that we made to the UK Pact to provide us grant support to start preparing those municipalities and transitioning their projects towards at least feasibility stage, because at that stage, then our project preparation facility can come in and then transition the projects further to bankability. So when you look in the market, you'll find that you've got this, not many project preparation facilities, but even those that you have got their own peculiarities and sometimes gaps that needs to be addressed. So that, I think that is an important thing to, to look at. And I believe that's why Andy was talking about, having within green banks, a possibility of also looking at project preparation. I think that is an important contribution. The other thing I just wanted to mention quickly is that when we started our own climate finance facility, the idea was that we were going to support sub-projects directly. And then what we started to experience in the market was that sometimes due to size of projects, you aren't able to support them because, the transaction costs versus, what you need to invest just don't make a sense, which is what brings back the question of, aggregation that was mentioned earlier. So then we had to go back to the GCF to say, we want to tweak the climate finance facility a bit to include financing through intermediaries. And these intermediaries, in this case, specifically financing institutions. And the idea was to say a financing institution can aggregate a number of smaller projects, but we don't have to go through the trouble of dealing with a number of those projects. We can finance that through, this intermediary, where there will be a centralized facilities that they are able to, to manage through their network. And I think that's, some of those things that needs to be done to tweak the products that we have in the market to appropriately respond to the need. But I think for me, a big thing, yes, is, a project preparation, and it's also to say, how do you harmonize the number of products that are out there to support the development of projects in such a way that the gaps are appropriately addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Olympus. And Samuel, I'm sure you agree with me when it comes to growing the capacity of the indigenous local private sector. There are challenges which are outside the project. There are policy environment, regulatory issues. From your point of view, from the point of view of a national development bank that is using or want to develop some of these green banking tools and methodologies in order to engage more the local commercial sector, both bank and non-bank, to be more engaged with the clean energy transition. What are some of the factors that need to be considered to create the right preconditions to accelerate the availability of these project pipelines, knowing also that in countries like Zambia and a lot of the countries in the region, at the end of the day, the SMEs are the backbone of development. They are the main source of employment. At the end of the day, they are major, agriculture, for instance, is a major contributor to GDP and including export earnings. So at the end of the day, when we talk about access to finance for SMEs, it is also about supporting the transition to low carbon sustainable development of the country. So what are some of these factors in your view?
Yeah. You see, for at least specifically for Zambia, our financial sector is not quite that developed. As you would see in the OECD countries where you have the financial sector, which is fairly liquid, they do have the resources that they can then allocate to projects depending on their risk appetite. In Zambia, for instance, we don't have that much liquidity. So the little liquidity that is there, the banks will ration them out and actually invest them in those areas that give them the highest return, and definitely not in the SME sector. We have, for instance, regulatory impediments in the financial sector itself, for instance, where if you are funding a project and the project is non-performing for 3 months, it's going to be recorded as non-performing. and for regulatory purposes, then you wouldn't pick a project that has got slightly a long tenure and a higher probability that it won't perform within the first 3 months, of its funding. Now, these sector-specific constraints needs to be addressed for the energy sector, because you cannot conceptualize an energy project today and hope that it will be profitable within the next 6 months, for instance. So the banks inherently have absolutely no incentive to take on projects of that nature, because they will have a challenge with their non-performing loan ratios with the central bank and other regulatory requirements. So you need to move into that space, SME space, and try to provide a dedicated instrument that will make these projects attractive to the commercial banks. On their own, there's absolutely no way a commercial bank would say, I'm going to finance an energy project and not to finance trade finance, for instance, where they make most profits. So they don't have much appetite unless we intervene with instruments that will make it bankable. And this is what I would do, for instance. You need to create a dedicated credit line for energy projects, which then you would pass them on to the commercial banks under the terms and conditions that they accept, but also that are amenable to the SMEs that are actually promoting those projects. You have to boost the liquidity of the financial sector to be able to lend specifically to the energy sector. That's number one. The second is that there is a challenge on pricing on the project side. If you are doing an off-grid project, from the investment side, it's perhaps viable. On the commercial side, who are you supplying the energy to? What will be the optimal pricing for it to be profitable? So on the demand side, you have constraints. Households perhaps want to uptake the energy at a cost lower than is optimal from the investment perspective. So you need to intervene again from the pricing side to ensure that these projects become commercially viable from the perspective of the demand side, that the demand side will be able to uptake the energy at a price which will enable the project to be commercially viable. So that's the second one. I think the third is that the infrastructure component for developing countries is not the same as the infrastructure you find in the OECD countries. So if you're doing an off-grid project, you perhaps have to lay down the physical infrastructure yourself. If you're doing that project in the OECD countries, maybe the infrastructure is already there. However, the lack of infrastructure in itself is an opportunity to build better in Africa, because then you can leapfrog the technology and build a network better that can actually take on different types of energy sources into the grid than bring down all the grids and start to rebuilding them from the scratch. So again, you need to intervene also in the energy on the infrastructure side to make these projects actually bankable from the perspective of the commercial bank. The last thing I want to talk about is a policy constraints. Policy constraints both in the financial sector, but policy constraints also in the energy sector. So I'll start with the policy constraints in the energy sector. The tariffs, the feeding tariffs and the grids, you have to relook at that ecosystem altogether, so that those that are investing in solar energy, for instance, are able to feed into the national grid in a more predictable fashion, that those particular projects will have a return at the end of the day. The second is that for large ones, other than the SME ones, for the large projects, then of course you need a development perspective to it, but the commercial banks will not be able to lend to them. That's for sure. So you need to work with a development bank like ourselves or South Africa Development Bank to extend credit directly to those sectors through the regional development banks, because commercial banks, quite frankly, will know what to do. Then my last point on the policy constraints, we still have quite a number of policy constraints in the financial sector. I'll give you an example. If I initiate, I underwrite a project today, even for us as Development Bank of Zambia, and 3 months later, the project does not perform in terms of servicing its obligation with us, it becomes a non-performing loan. And then, quite frankly, most SME promoters in the renewable energy sector will not be bankable until we have a deliberate specific policy to say we are going to promote SME lending under the following terms and conditions, and that the regulators of the financial sector are brought on board to understand the unique circumstances facing the sector, so that we can actually have policies put in place specifically to promote or to address the unique circumstances that SMEs in the renewable energy space actually are faced with, to address the specific constraints that commercial banks face in choosing to finance energy projects, projects in the energy sector. Unless those are addressed specifically at the national level, bringing all the stakeholders together, boosting liquidity alone will still be constrained by the policy environment in which these projects are operating. So I think for me, from the ecosystem in Zambia, about the financial sector, I think that we need a dedicated program, financial program, to fund SME actors in this particular space. If we don't have a dedicated program that obviates some policy constraints in the financial sector, liquidity alone, de-risking alone, perhaps will not even help much. So we need an ecosystem built specifically for a country like ours, from the scratch. You can't just take a model from Europe, from America, and say green banks in Zambia will come and work. It definitely will not work. We'll have to architecture the financial system to support the SME promoters, SME projects in the energy space. Other than that, it will be the same story. We provided credit, there was no uptake, the investments failed, and it will be the same cycle. So for me, what I'm putting on the table for discussion is that we need to architecture the green banks for Africa in a particular way that specifically addresses the constraints that we have seen in the sector. We also need to architecture the policies for the energy sector to suit the financial arrangements we are putting in place. So if we do these two, perhaps we'll be able to come up with a model that works for Africa. The opportunities for mitigations are highest, and therefore any grants that come into financing that definitely will be rewarded. You know, you can sink the most carbon by reducing fossil fuel use. You can sink the most carbon by transitioning households from biomass energy to clean energy. So the benefits are huge, but the market will not price those. We need to architecture a system that basically prices that specifically for our countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Samuel, can't agree more with you. Unfortunately, we lost Franny, but I believe you addressed some of the questions that I had prepared to her, specifically with respect to overcoming market barriers and accelerating project pipelines. If there are additional questions to the panel from the audience, please put them on the chat. Meanwhile, I would like to go back to Andy. And now, after this very rich discussion and the experiences that were shared by Olympus, very hands-on experiences, and by Samuel from architecture point of view, from country-specific circumstances and requirements. Andy, would you be able to summarize some of the key differentiating factors with respect to the evolution of the green bank model, so that the model indeed can play such catalytic role for sustainable development, climate objective, and disease in these countries' markets we're discussing today? And I think this is the same reflection. I think we still have only 6 minutes left. So basically, I would just like to take a round, and if we can just take this opportunity for final reflections on the applicability of the green bank model, starting with Andy.
Sure. So I'll just take a couple minutes to do that. And I think Samuel's comments pointed us in exactly the right direction. The entire nature of the green bank model is intended to be market-driven, market-specific, and country-owned. So as Samuel said, a green bank that works for the UK or Australia is not the right green bank for Africa. And that is the beauty of the model, that it is designed to specifically help a country shape its climate finance architecture in a way that can bring in the right sources of capital that are market fit to the interventions needed to free up the flow of public capital. And looking at some of the questions, there's a great example of that. James made a comment, the idea that we need a bottom-up approach versus top-down, both in terms of policy and enabling environment and the nature of how the green bank sits in the market, as well as the kinds of projects and kinds of financing mechanisms that it utilizes. And the very nature of the green bank is that it is bottom-up, in that it is country-defined and market-driven. The other key characteristic that I would like to emphasize, and then I'll pass it forward to Olympus and Samuel, is that the nature of the capitalization of the green bank is an essential component of ensuring that the investment criteria and mandate are a fit with market needs. So bringing in the right kind of capital that is specifically focused on the pipeline and specifically focused on absorbing a certain amount of risk and lowering costs so it can participate to accomplish that in the market is key. So the role of the Green Climate Fund alongside the other co-financiers in bringing in capital that is specifically suited to the needs of the mitigation and where you can, the adaptation financing is a key ingredient of what can make a green bank actually function in any given country's market. So I think those are the points that it makes sense to emphasize at this point, and in the interest of time, I'll pass it forward.
Olympus, I had the same question, but as you're answering it from your point of view, how do you ensure that the green bank model or the climate finance facility that's modeled on the green bank model or overall TBSA, when you invest, you're complementary to the role of the commercial bank sector, but you do not crowd out investment, you crowd in investment, and you do not create market distortion. How do you ensure that as you are applying this model?
Thank you very much for that question, and I think it's a key one. Because as I started earlier, I did mention that the idea is to try to crowd in as much investment, private investment, into addressing both mitigation and adaptation. So it will definitely be counterproductive if you're going to use these facilities just to crowd out private investment. So one of the things that we do on our side is we place very special attention to ensuring that the projects that we support, there is a clear case of additionality. We would not want to be involved in projects that clearly can go on without the climate finance facility. So that's a very important part of the work that we do. But to ensure that that is done properly, all of the projects that we take through our climate finance facility, they go through your normal DBSA credit process. But specifically for the climate finance facility, we have added a step in the appraisal process where we have a dedicated committee that looked at first ensuring that the projects that we support are aligned to, if you like, the CFF/GCF criteria. But more importantly, we look at additionality. We interrogate as best as we can the project to ensure that it would not happen without our intervention. That can be challenging because ordinarily, in doing business, you are looking for business with the view that you want to bring projects to financial close. So the temptation can always be that when you don't see additionality, you still want to support that project to meet your targets or your performance measure. But because this is clearly defined in the log frame and the indicators that we have in place in terms of measuring the performance of the climate financing facility, additionality is a key measure, is a key requirement. And with that, we want to ensure that we do not crowd out private investment. I know our time is very limited, but there's just one point I wanted to add, which I think is quite key. It's not related to your question anyway, but it is the question of saying you are having institutions, financial institutions broadly, doing their best at this point to align with, with the Paris Accord, trying to transition portfolios to try to reflect that. And sometimes it's very difficult to turn a big ship. So when you start incubating something like a green bank model facility within a bank, it provides for you an opportunity to start embedding, within the institution processes that start to move the institution towards alignment with Paris. And that's what we have seen in our case, where we started the climate financing facility. From that, we started having a climate change policy framework that defines the targets in terms of how much financial flows we want to see going into mitigation and adaptation, putting in place processes to ensure that that happens and monitor that and report on that in a transparent manner. And that is starting to to influence how we do things within the institution. And directionally, we can see a big impact that helps the bank to transition in the right direction. And I think maybe that's one of the things that you might overlook in terms of the importance of these green bank models in what it can do for the financial institutions themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for all the panelists for these great insights. So what I'm hearing, what I'm taking away is green bank models, country-driven facilities, country-driven functions. These functions need to be placed within a larger ecosystem approach, system-wide approach, because it's not just about finance. There are a variety of other factors that would influence the success of the model. And what I also hear is that incubating these functions into development finance institutions or national development banks can accelerate the pace, because it will also start changing some of these processes and start engaging with the players around you in a different way, and it would also have positive impacts on accelerating some of these green project pipelines, which are the key to tap into investment opportunities. Thank you so much. This has been an exciting discussion today. I really want to thank all of you for participating and for sharing your insights, and looking forward to continuing working, collaborating with all of you. Thank you.